And, oh God, as we gather today in your name, we're grateful for a number of things. One, for safety. At the same time, we're grateful for an opportunity to gather in your name, to study, to talk, to reflect, to learn. Ultimately, what we want is for it to be leveraged and used by you so that what is created is an applied sense of knowledge that is used to help us all grow in our faith. For the purpose of making disciples, it's not just for our own personal benefit. It's to be used by you in the world so that what people see in us is what it's like to follow Jesus Christ. And so we offer ourselves for that dual purpose, one for learning, and then at the same time for commission, the commissioning out to be salt and light in the world. And so again, we give you this time as we give you our minds and our bodies for the purpose of your kingdom. And we pray this in your name. Amen. All right, so I know it's been like 3 weeks. If you have forgotten, we are looking at A.W. Tozer and a little book he wrote called The Knowledge of the Holy. And to sort of reorient us again, Tozer's mid-1950s looks out not into just culture like the world or really the United States, but he's looking at the country at that time, but he's really looking at the church culture at that time. And so he's writing to Christians, he's writing to believers. He's not just writing this treatise to whoever. And the idea is he is worried, anxious, that people have lost this awe for God. They've lost the wonder of God. They've lost the vastness of who God is, and how that can play out in a person's life, whether it be in personal devotion, whether it be in witness, whether it be in worship. And so the purpose of this book is to dust off the awe. I mean, it's to remind people of who God is. And the best, because God is on part of the ledger of the Creator, and we're on part of the ledger that is the creation, there is also a vast difference in how in the world can the creation really understand anything about the Creator. They're not of similar substance. They're not on the same page. And Tozer acknowledges that and says that if God did not reveal himself in what we call revelation, then we would never know. But thankfully, God has revealed himself. And so what is it that we perceive in that revelation? He eventually says those are the attributes of God. And so the book is about the different attributes of God on the idea of what people or creation side of the ledger can understand by what's been revealed by God for the purpose of us reclaiming the wonder of who God is. So that's the goal of the book. And each chapter, or sometimes there's one or two chapters linked together that are sort of focusing on one major or a certain attribute. But every chapter or every group of chapters is just one right after the other. So let's go back and think for a second. If you were to look at what I would call the 50,000 meter view of what the attributes of God, or at least what has been revealed, you could break it down into two categories. One would be the category of transcendence, and that is the idea of separate, completely wholly other, totally removed from, where you would have creation and then all the way over here, totally separate from creation, totally its own entity. That would be transcendence. And we get that word, many of the words in both the Hebrew and in the Greek, in both Old Testament and New Testament, that have to do with holiness, they have roots that are tied to transcendence. I mean, one of the hagios, which is the word where we get saint, where we get holy, I mean, that same root in the Greek means wholly other, completely separate than, set apart, totally, just not even of the same substance. So on the 50,000 meter view, whenever we talk about, or whenever there are attributes, that deal with this idea that God is completely wholly other than creation, unknowable, totally separate. Anything that has to do with that level, that's what we call transcendence in theology. Now, the other side of the 50,000 meter view is what we call immanence, and that is the idea that, and it's the opposite of transcendence. So if transcendence is completely separate, other, then immanence is a part of. Transcendence, unknowable, immanence, knowable. So you have two different sides of the coin when we talk about who God is, what's been revealed. So we think about, if you read in the book of Psalms, and they're that and some of the prophetic language in the Old Testament, they're the best examples of this idea of transcendence and immanence at the same time, because you'll have the psalmist writing about, who can know your ways, you're totally separate, how holy you are. This idea of holy other. And then the psalmist will also write, where can I go to get away from you? You are there, you're here, you're there, you're everywhere, you know me, the hairs on my head, you know my rising, my laying down, my comings, my going. All that is, the psalmist is writing about transcendence and immanence depending on what particular psalm you're looking at. So when we look at the book and we think about what's been revealed to us, on the 50,000 meter view, you've got these two major attributes, transcendent, immanence. Now, if we were to parse these, further down, so say we're not at the 50,000 meter view, now we're at the 10,000 meter view, we could take these two and divide them into these three. And you probably have heard that language before. The omnis is what I call it. The everywhere, powerful, knowledge, all that just means all presence, all knowledge, all power. So we move from 50,000 to 10,000, and we talk about, what does it mean for God to be separate, unknowable, and yet in and knowable when it comes to space? Where's God at? And you probably can name a ton of scriptures related to those. What does it mean about God's knowledge, as in being separate than creation and yet part of creation? What does it mean about God's power in being separate than creation and also a part of creation? So if this is 50,000 meter view, this is 10,000 meter view. And then we could put other attributes like God's wisdom, God's love, God's holiness. They could also be, so if we go from 10,000 meters to 1,000 meters, we could parse it down a little bit more into words that we're probably more comfortable with, like love, grace, kindness, those types of attributes of God. But I just wanted to reorient us on, large, sort of large, and then we could get down into something that's even a little bit more obtainable when it comes to our comfort level of what we normally talk about when it comes to God. So let me stop for a second. So this is somewhat a review, but also an introduction of maybe some new phrases that you might have heard or maybe might not have heard in a while. So we all good? All right, so this has to do with omnipresence, the idea that God is everywhere, okay? Omniscience has to do with what God knows, knowledge, and omnipotent has to do with God's power. This is kind of a word for power. Y'all want the fan on? Y'all good? We're actually our heat is working so well that it's blowing cold air. So we're making 60-degree boiler water. So we're not working. So it's easier to study when it's cooler than it is when it's hot. I just want y'all to know. Yeah. All right, this is chapter 10 through 14. Now I know, all right, so let me tell you why I'm doing this. I think 10 through 14 is weak. Is weak. I think. So I'm pretty sure we finished 9 because I remember doing the God being unmovable. But right, I think we did chapter 9. If I'm pretty sure either that or I dreamt it in my flu in in my dreams that were flu infused. All right, so chapter 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 have to do with these. All right, chapter 9 I think is a pretty decent chapter. Okay, 10 through 14, don't waste your time on it. I mean, you can read it. Okay, I mean, read the book. That's fine. I mean, but it's weak in my mind. So we're leaving. I'm going to give you some Shane Green along the lines of A.W. Tozer. So this is why we're doing what we're doing today. All right. So we're going to skip all that? No, you can read them. I'm not. We're doing 10 through 14 today. So I mean, and this is. So think back when you're in college and when the professor says, "All right, here's the book. Read the chapters. You need to pay attention to the chapters. But now in these particular chapters, I want you to pay attention to class notes." That's what we're doing today. All right. So 10 through 14, we're going to see how far we get because I know some people also have to go to a luncheon today, or at least I think some are. For our house, maybe not. Now, how am I the only one that got pegged with going to a luncheon with Kirby Smart? So, I mean, to which I cannot wear, the person that invited me to go, I said, I have no desire to go listen to Kirby Smart. One, for a while he was at Alabama, which I definitely don't care for, and now he's at Georgia, which is equally, distasteful. And I said, well, can I come with my Auburn bow tie? And the person said, nope. And I said, well, can I just yell out a War Eagle when I first get there? And he said, equally not productive. And I said, well, and the person that's invited me, I said, I'm your fan, so I'm going representing you. But I'll wave my little silent flag of protest that says, I really don't care. I love the children's home, but We'll give Kirby a shot. He's a Georgia guy. I mean, Georgia, like from South Georgia. So there's some of that. All right. Anyways, I have a luncheon to go to, so we'll have to quit right on time. So 10 through 14. I mean, chapter 9, that has to do with this idea that there's no substance or force that can move God without God's willingness to want to be moved. All right. So that's the teaching on chapter 9. Well, that sits with this idea of God being everywhere and then also God's power, right? So, I mean, what are the Newton's law of physics? What's law number 2? That it takes a equal force to, or I can't remember. I have to dust that off. I mean, you can Google them up if you want to. I mean. But the idea of, in order for something to move that is at a place of rest, it takes an equal or greater force to move an object that is at rest. All right. So if God is at rest, is there a force larger than God that could make God move? Well, chapter 9 says no. That God, right. Oh, I'm just telling you what chapter 9 says. So, but that again sits in this 10,000 meter view of how we talk about what has been revealed to us, that God is everywhere in the world, that God knows all things in the world, and then God is all-powerful. Now, we're going to unpack those, because that's, again, this is 10,000 meter view, so what does that look like in our own life, say at the 1,000-meter view or the 500-meter view? So I'm just going from very general to more specific, and then we're going to get to very specific as we go through our lesson. But Tozer, to his credit, in chapter 9 through 14, as in all of the chapters, acknowledges that when it comes to human being, you have to put on the top of your paper with a little asterisk something that says we're finite beings and we're trying to comprehend the infinite. So there's always needs to be an asterisk that says, unless God reveals We're limited. And what we know about God is only what God has revealed. Right? Correct? I mean, tell me if we're right or wrong. All right? Yes, we are right. There is acknowledgement there. Finite seeks to understand the infinite, which means there's always going to be a little bit of a struggle there, which hopefully will help us reclaim the awe. I mean, the idea, the vastness of God and God's goodness. And, have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? All right, so you see pictures of the Grand Canyon, even if you haven't been there, right? You see a movie or a TV show or whatever, but they never prepare you for that first visit to right at the edge, right? I mean, you just sit there and you go, boy, I've just underplayed this. My expectations were just way too short. Well, that's sort of like this. All right? I mean, there's some things that we will never know about God because we're not on that side of the ledger unless God reveals it. What we do know about God is what God has revealed. And so it's like we're walking with God, but at some point we're going to get to the edge of the cliff and you're going to get a little bit of an insight of maybe something that you didn't know, which hopefully leads you to the point of, wow, I've underplayed this. This is far greater than I ever could imagine. All right? Finite, seeking the infinite. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of God being everywhere, omnipresent, God being everywhere at all times. And there's scriptures. Now, the way we describe this, where's my stuff? All right. So if we're going to look at the idea of God being everywhere, we talk about it in different terms. Now, we might say that God is naturally present in every aspect of the natural order of history and of the world. Psalm 8 would be an example of this, okay? You've got this idea of, God being present. You've set your glory in the heavens, and people know that. You're in the stars. You're everywhere. 139. Yeah, this is not an exclusive list. I'm just going to give you one just because we could spend 5 sessions on just one particular either one of these 7 ways that we talk about God's presence. We also say that God is actively present in different ways throughout every aspect of history as guiding the human affairs. Psalm 48, as an example, this idea right here. I mean, it's just one example, okay? I mean, the idea that God is directing kingdoms and what have you. Book of Exodus, when it comes to the interplay between Moses and Pharaoh, is another example. The whole book of Isaiah, you can find, hundreds of examples inside of Isaiah. So just, again, examples of the idea that when we talk about God being everywhere, well, what does that mean? How do we experience that? What does that play out? Well, God is naturally heavens, earth, mountains, valleys. At the same time, he's active, so it's not just that God is passive. God is active in the direction of human affairs and in the world. We would also talk about the presence of God, that God is attentively present to all those who call upon His name. Maybe Matthew, if 2 are gathered in my name, agree on earth. Anybody that asks, I have to look at what version I'm looking at. God is there. There's other ones in the Sermon on the Mount. Ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall find. Knock and the door will be open unto you. The idea is that God is attentive inside of the world. We would talk about judicially present in the sense of moral awareness. For instance, do you think God seeks to influence you morally? Well, I would hope so. All right. So I mean, well, right. So again, so good for you. Thank you. Get an A. Go back to a couple lessons ago where we talked about when we looked at the different ways that we talk about being creating in the image of God, and the chief way is that we're morally created in the image of God. This is a Wesleyan understanding of humanity, anthropology. And so when we talk about God being presence, is that the presence of God is active in the life of a person or in people for a sense of morality. And if you don't like that term morality, that's fine. Holiness, I don't care. I mean, you use whatever term you want. But the idea that God is not passive, God is active through the role of the Holy Spirit in the life of the person and wanting to create the nature of Christ, where a person's morals are a part of that. You might have heard someone say, for conscience sake, things like that, same concept. Good example there would be Psalm 48 is an example. We would also talk about God being bodily present in the incarnation. Maybe the best passage there is this one. I'm sure y'all familiar with this, John chapter 1. You can go through the first 18 verses. You can look at the other Gospels, but this idea of what does incarnation mean? What does it mean for God to be incarnate? Part of that is that in the body of Jesus Christ, that there's an incarnation. That's what incarnation means, with flesh. Do y'all eat Mexican food? Chili con carne. What is that? Chili with meat. All right. Jesus is, yeah, exactly right. I mean, it's incarnation means with meat, with flesh. So now you're all hungry, right? So I mean, but that's a terrible example of the incarnation. So I mean, feel free to edit that one. But that's a good idea with the idea that God is bodily present. And so then we also, if you were in church this past Sunday, in pretty much the Methodist Church, I would imagine this took place. God is mystically present in Holy Communion, in the Eucharist. When we talk about sacrament, one of the ways that we interpret sacrament is that it's a mysterious means of grace, which means that it's not 100% easy to define, but what we acknowledge and believe is that in some form or fashion, and you can argue whether it's transubstantiation or consubstantiation about what happens to the body and the cup when there's a consecrated prayer. That's another topic. But both of them, whether it be trans or con, is the idea that God is present there in some form or fashion. And, maybe the word that's good for us is this idea of this mystical presence. I don't know how you are with mystic. Some people like it, some people don't. Tozer actually is a mystic, which means that God is, he loves to talk about an experiential faith, which means when you read his book, you read one, The Pursuit of God, now you're reading this one, every page talks about this level of experience with God. Well, whenever somebody talks about an experience with God, they move from thinking language to feeling language, right? So the idea is what do you feel? Well, you're tapping into the idea of mystical language, whether you know it or not. But what we believe, Ephesians 2 is a good example, John chapter 6. You could look at the other Gospels, particularly the upper room. You could look at 1 Corinthians has language about the Eucharist, about Holy Communion. And then the last one we talk about God being, God's presence, where that's at, the idea that He's sacredly present and becomes known in special places where God chooses to meet us. 1 Corinthians 11 would be an example. Matthew chapter 18, 20, that's where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. I'm also in their midst. That passage there. So if you were to parse, again, this 10,000 meter view of when we talk about God in space, and the idea that God is everywhere, some of the ways that we might describe that is with this language. And that's what we just did. Now, there might be other ways, other terms that you might want to use. That's fine. These are sort of theological in their makeup. But what we would all say, I would imagine, and believe is that God is with me in the world, right? But when you talk about that, you're talking about this in some form or fashion. So let me stop. So we went from 5,000 feet, meters. Now we went to 10,000, and then we jumped from there to maybe the 1,000-meter view or the 500-meter view with some level of scriptural help and guide. And I would bet if you were to go back and reflect upon your life, you would probably find examples from your own life, even outside of Scripture, which means that Scripture is a way to verify this, but from your own experience, there is a way to verify this, how these all have played out in your life in some form or fashion. All right, naturally present. Are there places that you go to, geographically speaking, that you feel closer to God? Okay, yeah, all right. So, why is that? Well, maybe God is present in the world. Are there times where you felt God directing you morally? When it comes conviction, anybody ever had conviction? Afraid so. So yeah, exactly right. Yeah. So if you have sinned, you have had conviction. I promise you. Okay. So this is the idea. And what's that about? Well, because God is present in the world and present in you, and God is not content to have an amoral being, which means it doesn't matter. God is content on having a being that looks like the nature of His Son. So the work of the Holy Spirit is to move people morally into something that looks like the nature of Christ. Bodily present, communion, baptism, other sacraments, could be foot washing. I mean, there are other denominations have more than 2 sacraments. By the way, if you've never participated in a foot washing service, look at your faces, all right, so I got it. I don't know how to say it this way. It's going to sound real preachy, and I don't mean it this way. You really need to. I mean, it's so humbling. And the issue, most of us wouldn't have a problem with washing someone else's feet because we don't have a problem with serving. You can be in a high position and still serve. But to allow someone else to wash your feet, that is incredibly humbling. So, I mean, if you haven't, give it a go. Maybe 1 year, see what it's like. All right. So, or what we could do is we could just all go over to Sandy. We're good to come to your new house. We can go to Sandy's house, and she'll set up some stations, and y'all can wash each other's feet. So, all right. But there are other examples. I mean, you could probably find these in your own life. Sacredly present, these special places where you meet God. There are people who come into our chapel sometimes in the morning, and they sit and they pray. Or they come into the sanctuary, and it's not a formal prayer or anything like that, but for them, in that place, at that particular time, for those moments, is sacred, and it allows them to connect to God. Well, how do we talk about that? Well, we talk about God being everywhere inside of those places. All right?
Don't you think that doing that is, because in this busy world, you need to have a place where you're not going to be interrupted?
Sure. Now, I mean, I think, all right, so the idea of fasting, which we talked a little bit, that's a means of fasting. I said this Sunday, and I'll say it again. It is probably the most needed discipline in our life today, and it is the least practiced. And I'm not talking about going without food. Some people, they have to take certain foods, they have to take medicine, things like that. That's fine, all right? But there's something that you can give up. Now, it might be time that you would be doing what you normally do, and so maybe your time you go and you set aside, you're sitting in the chapel, sitting in a place of rest or solitude or quiet, to just give your time. Sabbath is about embracing a different rhythm. All right? The reason why we associate rest with Sabbath, it's not because there's something innately holy about rest. It's not. But what do you do for 6 days during the week? You don't rest. So the idea is then to get a different rhythm because you're not a commodity. I mean, so the idea is you say to everything that you're involved in, on this particular day, I listen to a different rhythm. Because I'm a human being, I'm not a human doing. And so that's what fasting helps us. I mean, what Sabbath is self-denial. That's fasting. You're giving up what you normally do, and we need that. I mean, this is not a theological word. We stink. at Sabbath. Which is why our bodies break down and our relationships sometimes break down, and because we think that some of you, or some, not you, some people will purchase a new car every few years, and we think our bodies are stronger than the cars that we drive, and it's nowhere near that. All right. So we just run, and then all of a sudden something breaks and we start scratching our head and often go, well, God, why did this happen? Well, because God has been screaming for us to slow down. We just kind of blow through that. It's kind of like everything's a yellow light. What do you do when you see a yellow light? Well, what you do, immediately you say, can I beat it? What's around? Because if I can beat it, guess what I'm doing? We do that in our life, and the person who the best sermon series I've heard on this is from a guy named Andy Stanley. Some of you know Charles Stanley out of First Baptist Atlanta. It's his son, North Point. You might be familiar with him. He did it. This is years, so it's a long time ago. It's probably 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. He preached a sermon series on margin. That's the name of it, margin. And he said that in every aspect of your life, physically, relationally, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, financially, whatever little aspect of your life you want to look at, you need margin. Which means that you can't live at the max of that all the time. So financially, live beneath your means. Emotionally, give time for your body to recharge mentally with your relationships, which means you have to give time for your relationships. Love, this idea that says quality time, that's such garbage. It is. Let me tell you, it is. Whoever came up with that is just, they're selling you something. Love is spelled just T-I-M-E, which means it's quality time and it's quantity time. Think back to the people who are most significant in your life. There will be those quality moments that are those high points, but they are not the norm. They're not. They're the once a year, once in a blue moon, or whatever it may be. They're the kairos time in the Old Testament, which is mountaintop to mountaintop or valley to valley. The overwhelming majority is the chronological time. It is the day in and day out. But if you think you're more than what you're created to be, well, you'll run your body to the max, and unfortunately, we'll do your funeral long before it's your time. It is what it is. We're not superheroes. And so Sabbath and fasting and all the disciplines are creating a different rhythm. And it's learning that God, and embracing those areas where God is everywhere. And to acknowledge that, and then to own it in your life, and then to give time and energy to it for your edification, for your benefit. It doesn't benefit God. God does not need people. I know that's shocking. We think that He, we...
I have a hard time with that, like need versus, I don't know how to explain it right, but having God not, be omnipresent and overall, but then caring or wanting to be in our lives.
Yeah, so the issue is the difference between need and choice. All right? So, someone doesn't necessarily need something for life, but yet they choose to be a part of that out of their own sense of power and freedom and ability. That's when we talk about God in both of these and in here, is there a need in God to make God complete or fulfilled? And the answer is no. But out of God's goodness, His nature, He chooses to be a part of. All right, but they're different. They're different, and they're worlds apart. So when we say God does not need humanity, that is not an uncaring God. It is just that God doesn't need anything to be fulfilled. He is complete in and of himself. And he chooses to act and to give and to be a part of, not because he's codependent, as if to say, Beth, love me, want me, things of that nature. And if you do that, then I'm going to be better or feel better or perceive myself to be better. God is already better. Just chooses to give out of his goodness. And maybe the best example would be where someone, now, just think on this, and then we're going to take a break. Think this is going to be your homework over break. This is going to be your break work. Theoretically, even though you are a relational person, you don't need another person to make you complete. And I'm talking about your spouse, friends, children, grandchildren. You do not. It doesn't mean that they're not important to you, okay? But you do not need them. The healthiest people in the world are the ones who acknowledge that they don't need an outside person or substance to give them value. Okay, so if we use counseling language, give them identity. But now, that's different than saying, someone adds value to your life and loving you and caring and whatnot. That is a choice that you make to engage and be a part of. But they are separate. And I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings, all right? I mean, one of the biggest lessons I had to learn as a husband is that my wife really doesn't need me to be whole. I thought, what? Please. Don't you realize? Well, I mean, seriously, same with her, all right? Same with my children, who I would have no problem dying for any of that. I mean, for my children, for my spouse, that would be, if it meant edification for them, let me tell you, I'd sign on that line all day long. But I don't need them, nor do they need me to be whole. But now, thankfully, we are involved together, so there is levels of where I receive something, but I can be whole in and of myself, and they can be whole in and of themselves, and so can you. God is whole without us. God chooses out of that wholeness to share with us, but they are not the same. So just chew on it. It's deep. I got it. I mean, and it hurts. It hurts the pride. I mean, I understand that. We start talking about family and faith and things like that. So you have maybe 5 minutes or so, 7 minutes to let this mull around while you break. righty, so we'll go ahead and come on back. And jump back into this whole concept. And again, we're looking at chapters, that somewhat has to do with chapter 9, even though not as much, but really chapters 10 through 14. It's not that the chapter is not, those chapters are not good. I just think we could do better. So, but in chapters 10 through 14, I erased it, sorry. In 10 through 14, we're dealing with this idea of where's God as in presence. Also the idea, so we talked a little bit about that. Now what I want to do is move into this idea of what does God know? And so see if we can get a fair amount of that in. The idea of omniscience is God being all-knowing, and I mean, so what would be some scriptures that come to your mind that would have to do with about the knowledge of God? Just anybody right off? Yeah, so you got the Jeremiah, that's right, knew me in the womb, Jeremiah passage. Again, we could look at some of the different psalmist writings about, particularly around you know me. When it talks about the psalmist, some versions will translate this way about, God knowing my bones, the inner workings of my bones, things of that nature. All that again has to do with this idea of omniscience. When you get into the whole idea of prophecy, the idea of what God knows compared to what God doesn't know. And so one of the things that often comes up, even though we're okay with the idea of God all-knowing, I mean, that's pretty comfortable for us. The struggle for us is that because God knows, does God cause? I mean, what levels of causation are involved there? And is there a difference between what someone, in this case God, might know, and then does that end in God causing? So what are your thoughts around that? Yeah, so is there a difference between what God knows and what God causes?
I think God sees both sides of the equation,
All right. I'm not coming to you specifically. I'm going to get me something to eat because the line around this at the break is pretty long, and as I tear up our microphone. So if you just happen to be watching online, it's no way to describe the cake. It's really good. So whoever made that did an excellent job. So you said, Pat, you said both sides of the ledger. What do you mean by that? It's hard to be eating at the same time, right?
like if you're going down the road and you come to a big hole, you can go around it or you can just fall right in.
Right.
So God knows which you ought to do, it's up to you to make that choice.
All right, so, okay.
I'm sure there's a better way to explain it, but that's just something.
Well, I'm going to interpret what you said around what we call the idea of God's knowledge around the actual and the hypothetical. All right, so this is where we're going to get really deep, so you just need to know. In theology, the way we talk about God's omniscience, all-knowing, is that God knows all possible outcomes from every action. Now, if you want an example of this, it was on TV actually last night. I should have recorded it, and then I could have sent it up here and we could have watched it. Are you familiar with the series Men in Black? You know, Will Smith. Y'all know Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones? All right, so it's a sci-fi. I told y'all Sunday I like sci-fi too. So sci-fi movie where there are these group of people called Men in Black. They're like the inner galaxy police people or whatever. And Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones are Agent K and J. And their job is to save the world from destruction from aliens and everybody else. In Men in Black 3, so you can go home and watch it, all right? I know I've lost some of y'all. Just smile and, pretend like, oh, wow, that sounds like fantastic, But in Men in Black 3, one of the ways that they're going to save the world is they've got to save this guy from who's being tracked down by this real bad guy. And the guy's ability is he's from a certain race of aliens that can predict all the outcomes. And so the comic relief in the movie is this guy, where like he walks into a restaurant, and if Ruth has the white cup today, which means that's going to open up a whole level of causation because she's drinking coffee out of the white cup. But if she had the blue cup, then a whole different set of outcomes would take place. And so again, I'm not doing it justice, but I like the movie because I like the actors. And but when we talk about that in theology, is God is aware and knows all the possible outcomes in every human action throughout all of human history. So just think about that for a second, which is what Pat was exactly talking about with the pothole, whether you knew it or not. So thank you very much for jumping us. We're now into the deep water, where there's a pothole. Does a person go around the pothole? Does the possible go in? Do they go into the pothole? But just because God knows that, is God then the cause behind every outcome? Well, why not? That doesn't sound right. Well, look at y'all. Get a little piece of cake and y'all show off. All right. So, right. So, God's knowing of all the infinite possibilities and all the potentials of what every one of those possibilities might hypothetically create does not mean that God causes those things to happen. But so the rub for people is, again, we like the idea of God, all knowledge, but there's normally a rub to some degree around the idea of does all knowledge lead to levels of causation, particularly when the causations are painful. And then the question might be, why did God even, so you hear this language, why did God even allow it? I mean, that's kind of where we're skirting this idea. Well, we know He doesn't cause it, but I don't like it. So let me see if I can come up with better language to make it sound better because it's pain, right? And so again, you can't get away from C.S. Lewis's problem of pain circa 3 years ago at St. Paul.
What is your answer to that? He knows it. Did He cause it?
The answer is no, He does not. Does not cause it. Yeah, it does not cause because there's a difference between knowing and then causing, which is not unlike how so again, what's one of the major analogies to use to describe God's relationship with people is the idea of parenting. So God is a parent. You got all kind of language of that inside the Old Testament and New Testament. When you are with your children or with your grandchildren or great-grands or whoever it may be, you can know something and not cause it.
Shane, I had a good example of that when John Hollis was little, and I bought the whole carpool Easter bunny, chocolate bunnies. And
Right.
And I said, everybody gets a chocolate bunny tomorrow. He wanted to open his mouth and eat just the ear.
Right.
And I said, well, you're likely to. You might eat the whole thing, then you won't have a bunny tomorrow.
Right.
And he said, no, I'm only going to eat the ear.
Right.
So I could have prevented him from doing that. But
Right.
I know he's got to be a grown-up person someday. So I let him.
So now you're even talking about something else, maturity. Yeah.
Sure enough, tomorrow he did not have a bunny.
Yeah.
They're bunnies, and I thought that was a pretty good example.
Yeah, you did better than me. My analogy would be when Connor was maybe 3, and we, from the time of where we thought there's levels of understanding, do not touch the iron, because the iron is hot. And so he is sitting, the ironing board's here, the iron's right there. He is sitting on the corner of the bed, and you see in his mind going, And so I'm just sitting like right here. You have to delete this because it's probably going to be child abuse. Maybe the statute of limitations have already expired. So he's just sitting there, and Brooke comes out of one room, and she's just watching me watch him touch the iron. And of course, that led to a wonderful conversation between Brooke and myself, to which my rebuttal was, I guarantee you, he will never touch that iron again.
I had the same situation with my oldest son with a little apartment we lived in. He was stove, it was electric, I think, in the wall, but it glowed. And he was just so enthralled with that heater.
Right.
Then I kept pulling, talking. He was listening. Well, one day I wasn't watching him do it, but he did touch it. And I knew immediately because
Right.
but he never touched it again.
Sure.
I had tried my best
Yeah.
not to touch that heater. He didn't know how.
Right. So what we're getting at is this idea that if God does know all things, particularly those future things, does that limit my freedom or your freedom or people's freedom? And of course the answer to that is also no. Just because God knows does not necessarily mean God causes. And when we talk about what God knows, we talk about foreknowledge, particularly those things that happen in the future. God's foreknowledge of events does not destroy the reality of other influences beyond the divine influence. Okay?
What does that mean, miracles?
All right, so miracles are the suspension of the natural created world for a specific purpose and a specific time. But they are not the norm. Okay? The norm is the created world. All right? And however that plays out. The suspension of those laws for a small period of time is what we call miracles. But they're short term and they're always limited. For instance, every single person that Jesus healed, you know what also happened to them? They died. All right? So, I mean, God's foreknowledge of events does not destroy the reality of other influences on top of the divine influence. God knows whether a marigold or whatever flower, you can say a rose, whatever, God knows whether that seed will bear into a flower. But that knowledge does not take the place of natural forces and levels of causality that have to happen in order for the seed to grow into a flower. Sometimes God is directly involved, but often God is not. And so we're talking about miracles there. God knew, and you can fill in the blank with any dictator. God knew that whether or not that dictator or not would be defeated. But no one imagines that simply God's foreknowledge of what would happen or will happen in itself directly caused the defeat without other historical, human, or natural forces or influences at work. Now, I worked real hard on that sentence, so I just want y'all to know. Does that make sense? God does know all things, whether those that are actualized or those that are hypothetical. But just because God knows does not mean that God calls. And the reason why there is a separation of that has to do not just with what God knows, but God's power. And the idea that God, being complete in God's self, allows people the freedom to make choices, which has everything to do with what He knows and the power to change or to not change things. So now we move from omniscience to God's power and how that plays out in the world. And God, so let me ask you this question. Do you think God can do all things? Are you sure? So the classical question that most college professors love to tell their students is, can God create a rock so big that He can't pick it up? Can God create a rock so big that He cannot pick it up? Which is a circle question. So, I mean, it's a trick question, because if you say yes, God can create a rock so big then that He can't pick it up, then God can't do all things because He can't pick up the rock. Well, if you say if He can pick up the rock, then He can't create a rock so big that He can't pick it up. So I mean, it's a dumb question, but it's because it's illogical. But the idea is something, when we talk about God being all-knowing, we say, yes, God does know all things, those things that are actualized and those things that are hypothetical, but does not cause. When we talk about God being all-powerful, the answer to that is both yes and no. Now, as good evangelicals, we like to say yes because sometimes we feel like we have to defend God. The God that we worship is all-powerful. God can do all things, right? So if you leave here and you see a bumper sticker that says, God can't do all things, there's going to be part of you driving down the road that goes, well, I don't know about that one, right? Sure. But there are a gazillion things God cannot do.
I know when we studied C.S. Lewis,
Mm-hmm.
and we talked about him giving us free will.
Mm-hmm.
But if he gave us free will, then he can't take that back. I don't know.
No, that's right. So you're on the same page, and that's pretty good from a couple of years ago. Look at you. It's, well, then you got enough. Let me tell you. So when we talk about this idea of what does it mean for God to be all-knowing everywhere and at the same time all-powerful, and yet what does that mean and does it mean for free will, is that can God be all-powerful and human beings have free will? The answer to that question is no, then God cannot be all-powerful. Because God has limited Himself on some things that He cannot do. He cannot be contrary to His nature. Cannot sin, cannot stop loving, cannot be, there's a lot of things that God cannot do. Now, we've been taught easy Sunday school answers when it comes to is God all-powerful, and it's like the children's sermon. They have their pet answers. The first one is God, the second one is Jesus, the second one is love, and church, and on down the line. So we're asked this question, is God all-powerful? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, no, He's not. I mean, there are a ton of things that God does not do, even in Scripture, and yet God still is what we call all-powerful in the sense that He's all-powerful according to His nature of what He has willed that He will do and will not do. And so if God gives people free will, I know I gave this to the guys. I don't know if I gave this to you, and if I did, then say, yeah, you did. Think of a card game, all right? So when God, I don't know if y'all play poker. What do y'all play, bridge or whatever? All right, so when I don't understand bridge. I like poker. The moment God deals you from part of His deck into the game, you now have freedom and power to play your cards, which means there are laws according to the game. C.S. Lewis, what Lewis said when it comes to back in the problem of pain, is if God creates a bat and it's part of the natural order, then the bat will be a bat regardless, even if you want to bang somebody up against the head with. What would be great would be is that it would only have the properties of a bat if it could be used like in baseball and things like that. But the moment that someone would want to play their card and use their freedom for ill purposes, that God somehow would magically take the bat from being made of wood or metal, whatever, that could cause damage, and turn it into like a marshmallow. All right? It says you can't do that because then you wouldn't have free will. Right? I mean, if it's only free will, as long as it's good and wholesome, then it's a limited free will. But if God deals you into the game, then you are dealt into the game, which means that God has limited Himself for the purpose of something in His mind that is greater, would be a created world where you have free will. So you can use your power and use your choice in whatever way that you want to bring about any level of end. And yet God still has this ability to be directly involved, or to allow the creation and the way that God has created it to play out in whatever rules or laws that have been dealt into the game. Are you with me? So when we talk about God being all-powerful, the answer is yes and no. God does have all power inside of the desired end of God and according to His nature. but not all power to be, whatever you want it to be for whatever purpose.
The sun shines on the wicked.
That's exactly right. So when we talk about God being all powerful, it's a yes with an asterisk or a yes and a no, because we have to ask a follow-up question: all powerful according to His will, or just some all powerful to mean that God can do every single action that would exist under the sun? And the one that talks about every single action under the sun, the answer is no, because God has dealt us into the game. Now, the beauty of God, in my mind, and this is probably 80% why I'm a Christian, is that God retains inside of His ability to be all powerful something that can eventually correct people's misuses of their freedom, and we see that in cross and resurrection. All right? So, and we underplay the power of that, because often we think about it just in individual terms. My salvation, grace offered to me, and things like that. We underplay the cosmic reality of what cross and resurrection means for all of creation. Now again, Tozer would say it's because it's the finite trying to understand the infinite. And I get that. He is correct. But we really don't have a clue of how wonderful and powerful that will be. I mean, there will be an experience, maybe others that we go through eventually, that where our ability to know and enlightenment or whatever opens up. But at least on this side, it's very limited. But what God has revealed when it comes to His power and free will, you see God's willingness to limit Himself and take unto Himself all the misuses of people's free will, and the way God redeems that is in cross and resurrection. I mean, if you struggle with the vastness of God, start here. And just to start with your own personal stuff, and then start with the stuff that you know about other people, and then start with all the hypotheticals that you just know about the history of people, and realize that at every single place along the way, God has redeemed, has redeemed, has redeemed, has redeemed, has redeemed, all the way throughout what's actualized and what's hypothetical, all because of death and resurrection. I mean, it's that large. Now, you see evidence of this, and this is the last little passage, and then we're going to end. You know, this idea of God limiting Himself. This is Philippians chapter 2, specifically when we're talking about Jesus. I'm looking up here about chapter 2, verse 6. And so the teaching is, Paul says, be like Jesus. Well, then the next question is, all right, well, what is Jesus like? Well, this is what Jesus is like. Who, being in the nature of God, did not consider that to be something to be exploited, His equality to be exploited, but rather making Himself nothing, taking on the nature of a servant. Other versions of the Bible say a slave. The word there is doulos, being found in human likeness. Humbled Himself, obedient, even death on a cross. Do not overlook this therefore. This is probably the most powerful word in that particular phrase. Because of everything that Jesus has done, 6 through 8, this is what it means. Well, God holds the trump card. And you see that in death and resurrection. So when we talk about the idea of what God has revealed, God is separate and yet a part of, both together. A little bit of a paradox, talking about transcendence, immanence. At the same time, we break that down through these omni words, the idea that God being everywhere and all places. At the same time, God knowing all things doesn't necessarily mean causes all things. And the idea that God being all powerful according to His nature, by the self-rules that He has created. Now, there are times where He suspends the rules. We call those miracles, but they are not the norm at all. They are just, and they're limited in scope and in time. All right? So that's 9 through 14. See how fast that was? You're all good. I meant to tell you this at the beginning. Many of you might remember Sue Henson, Ken and Sue Henson. Ken passed away a few years ago. Sue passed away last Saturday. Sue did. Her memorial service will be this Saturday at St. Paul at 3 p.m. 3 p.m. This Saturday. And I'm still working out all the details. I think the obituary, if it's not in the paper, will probably be, it's in the paper? Okay, yeah. I think they're going to visit before the service at 2. That'll be here in our church as well. And then memorial service will be at 3. All right, go in peace.